Hi and welcome to the podcast for session 5 of KV518. The theme for the podcast today is the idea of professionality, which I'll explain a bit more about as we go through. I'm going to talk about two key areas that relate to this theme. The first one relates to is to do with how we work alongside and relate to and develop working practices with other professionals. And then the second area is to do with how, as being professional, we have responsibility to develop our professional knowledge and continue to extend our practice and extend our professional identity through that development of knowledge. So two themes, one relating to working with others and what we might call interprofessionalism, and then the theme of developing professional knowledge as a way of continuing to develop our professional identity and our practice. So we first of all need to talk about and in a sense differentiate between the notion of acting professionally and being a professional. By acting professionally, and I think most of us would probably subscribe to the idea that acting professionally might mean being responsible in our work, conducting ourselves in a way that other people would see as appropriate, particularly when we're working with members of the public or the people that we are kind of providing a service for, as well as other professionals. And that might mean things like not being dishonest, turning up on time, dressing appropriately, using language which is not seen as offensive, and so on. So we would say, oh yes, that's a professional person, they're conducting themselves in a particular way. And that's slightly different to this notion of being a professional. And by being a professional, I mean perhaps having a kind of a status, if you like, and a level of identity, maybe a knowledge or a set of knowledges or a set of skills that we associate with one particular professional. In other words, being a professional social worker would probably be seen as very different to being a professional accountant. And we also recognise that some areas of work we would recognise as being professions. And I mentioned two there perhaps that we might agree on. The idea of being a social worker and being an accountant would often be seen as being professions, whereas other activities, other vocations, we might not see as necessarily as being a profession. And it's often kind of, in a sense, a kind of a debating point about what we mean by a professional. And perhaps more recently we've used the word professional in some areas to mean someone that's paid for their work. So hence a professional sports person, professional footballer would be somebody who is paid for doing that work rather than an amateur, someone who chooses to do it as a hobby, if you like. So this notion about being professional and being a professional is slightly different. And it's the combination of those two things, if you like, that I'm going to refer to in terms of professionality. The notion that we have a profession that identifies us and that we act professionally and we develop our professionalism through that role. So there are lots of ways of defining a particular profession. And I've included these series of bullet points here from some work that was undertaken in the early 90s, because I think it's quite interesting. So I'm not offering this as a definitive definition of what a profession is, but I think it's quite a useful one. And Simmons and Co. Define, if you like, or identify 5 main areas. I'm just going to talk through these 5 bullet points here and ask you to think about these as we go through them. And maybe think about them to what extent they are relevant or appropriate to the area that you are working in, as well as your kind of sense of what might a profession mean in its broad sense. So the first one is that, in terms of defining a profession, is that the professional field, is one that requires an altruistic orientation. And what that means is that the work that you're doing is for the public good, and you're doing it not just for a sense of it's a job that you do to pay the rent, as it were, to bring in money, but you do it because you're doing good for others. You're undertaking an area of work which is for others' reward and bringing good to society and providing a service that is of value to other people. So that sense of doing good for society and contributing to society, and that being first and foremost one of the reasons why you're working in that field. You want to do something for other people, is part of what we mean by an altruistic orientation. The second area here is it says a systematic body of knowledge and monopoly of powers over its applications. Let's look at those in those two parts of that sentence. A systematic body of knowledge. So there's an area of knowledge which is specific to your professional field. So if you think about the range of professions that we are working with in relation to this programme, early years, their area of professional knowledge might be different from those people working as a learning support assistant in a secondary school or a youth worker. So there's a set of knowledges, some of which you share with other professions, but also it's a set of knowledge that's definitive for your own professional field as well. And that area of knowledge is an area of knowledge that defines your field. And the second aspect of this same bullet point, monopoly of powers over its applications, what that means is that knowledge that it gives you is what defines your professional field, and only your professional field, in terms of what it does. So whilst you might share aspects of the knowledge with other professions, the totality of the knowledge that you have and the way that knowledge defines your field is unique to your profession. And in a sense, another way of putting it is, if you want to be a teaching assistant, then this is the area of knowledge that defines being a teaching assistant. And only teaching assistants will work in that particular way. So in other words, a profession is defined by its knowledge base and the way that it uses that knowledge in terms of its work. The third bullet point here relates to a code of ethics. And by a code of ethics, this is a statement of what it means to operate in that professional field, and particularly where the professional boundaries are, and if you like, how you operate in that particular field. Now, I think in some professions this is more clearly defined than others. So, for example, in medicine, we will probably recognise that the British Medical Council, for example, has a code of ethics for doctors in terms of the way the doctors are expected to conduct themselves. And similarly, in fact, in youth work, there's a statement of ethical practice for youth workers which defines the way that youth workers are required to work. In other professions, it's possibly less clearly defined in terms of a range of ethical statements which define that field. But nevertheless, there is an accepted, if you like, code of ethics which defines how we work. And at the heart of those codes of ethics are such values as respecting confidentiality of the client. A more extreme or more kind of specific aspect of that, certainly in terms of working with children and young people, is the way we are, as professionals, we accept and expect our colleagues not to enter into inappropriate relationships with children and with young people. So if you like, it's this thing about professional boundaries, but also about how we conduct ourselves within that professional field. The fourth bullet point here, the fourth dimension of what defines a profession, the sanction of the community at large, what that means is that the public, in seeing us as a profession, first of all, we are recognised as a profession, and the community, societies that we work with recognise that we have an important role and, if you like, approve us to exist as a profession. They're saying at some tacit or level that our profession is a good thing and they value what we do. It's that notion that we have the sanction of the community that we work with. And the fifth area here under this kind of defining profession relates to there being a qualification and entry procedures which define that profession, And in fact, that profession itself controls that area of qualification and entry procedures. And this is an interesting area because in more recent times, if you look in teaching, for example, the General Teaching Council that used to control the professional qualification and the entry procedures for the teaching profession has been taken over now by the government. So if you look at teaching as a profession, we might say that actually the teaching profession has lost its control over its own qualification entry procedures because the government has replaced the independent body by a governmental controlled body, the National College for Teaching and Leadership. And in social work, the same sort of thing has happened, where the government has taken on the responsibility of controlling the profession rather than allowing the profession itself to control itself. Okay, so we're moving on now to think about the way that we develop our professional identity, that we've already said kind of to some extent defines our professionality, and the way that that identity develops over time. It also changes as we're working. And you'll see here I've given you three examples from the wonderful world of animals to help us think about the way that we develop our identity and the way that that identity and role changes over time. The first animal there, you'll see the fantastic chameleon. Chameleon is noted for being able to change colour and change the kind of range of colours and its skin tone to blend in with its surroundings. So we might think, as a professional, to what extent do we adapt our practices to fit in with the circumstances that we're working in and the field and the people that we're working with? So, for example, if we're talking about the way a child's developmental needs give rise to a set of behaviours, how the child is growing up and developing and therefore how it's behaving, we might use language to define that when we're talking with other professionals, which is perhaps different to how we might talk about when we're talking about that same child with its parents. So we'll change our language to fit in with the people that we're talking with. So we adapt to our surroundings. I also remember as a youth worker, I would dress very differently when I was working directly with young people, either in the street, on the streets, or in the evenings, and that would be very different to how if I was going into how I would dress if I was going into a school to speak to other teachers about particular children or about young people more generally. So I would adapt my appearance depending on where I was working. Similarly, if I was going to court with a young person, I would dress very differently than if I was kind of working with them those young people in an everyday sense. So we change our appearance, we change our conduct, we change our behaviour. So that's kind of one notion, changing identity. Another one you'll see on the left there, the fantastic duck-billed platypus. I must admit, I'm particularly intrigued by duck-billed platypuses. If you've never come across them before, they're from the eastern side of Australia, and they seem to have a whole range of features which are a bit like a cut and paste kit from other animals. So, for instance, they're mammals, they're warm-blooded. The mothers produce milk, which feed their young, but rather than giving birth to live young, they lay eggs, which are a bit like reptiles. They also have this strange bill, which is a feature that no other mammals have at all. So I wonder sometimes, whether as professionals we adapt ourselves, not just in the moment, but we kind of have a bit of other professions that kind of built into us. I sometimes wonder whether, as a teacher and teaching assistants, at times, particularly with younger children, we need to have a bit of a nurse embedded within us. Sometimes we're expected to look after children who are ill and adapt our practices to take on some roles which perhaps aren't directly that of a teacher, but nevertheless are in the broad remit, if you like, of looking after children. Similarly, as a youth worker, I think in the past I took on roles which were sometimes almost that of a police officer or perhaps even a social worker, that we kind of took on professional roles, not entirely, but which echoed other professions. And I'll come on to that same practice of adapting our practices, and sometimes almost crossing over professional boundaries a bit in the next slide. And then the last animal that I've chosen here to illustrate this way that identities and roles change, of course, is the frog, and the way that animals will evolve within their lifetimes. That the frog goes through this process of changing from being frog spawn into tadpoles, into froglets, and into frogs, that we grow into our professional role. And sometimes it's only after we've been in a role for a while that we reach full maturity. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that you take on the attributes of the chameleon or the platypus or a frog in your everyday practice, but I'm asking you to think about how is your professional role changing over time. By definition, the fact that you're on this course means that you're an experienced practitioner, and it's always worth thinking about, so how have I changed over the period that I've been working with children and young people? Has my role changed? Has my professional identity changed? Do I have echoes of what I used to be in terms of my professional role, and where and how that identity has changed? So in terms of that notion of perhaps sometimes being able to work with and alongside other professionals, and even at times take on some of the areas or work within the areas that other professionals more comfortably work, I want to introduce you to the idea of the boundary spanner. And I think boundary spanners are increasingly essential in the sorts of roles that we find ourselves in. And the thing that I like particularly about the idea of a boundary spanner is that they're, if you like, able to have a foot in different camps. That as a professional, we're comfortable in our own professional role, but that we're able to have discussions and conversations and professional relationships with other professions that may have quite a different focus to the way we work and the particular roles that we have. In other words, we were able to span boundaries from one profession to another. And I think this is really, really important. So if you think, for example, if you are working with a child who is a looked after child that is in the care of the local authority, that whilst we clearly maintain a kind of a sense of what our own professional role is, we also have to have an appreciation of and be able to work with and have a foot in the camp of social work. We have to understand that what it might mean for that child to be with foster parents or within a children's home, or about to move homes or to be adopted and therefore moving into a permanent home with a new parent. And then we need to understand therefore the role of the social worker and the way the social worker is concerned for that child's well-being. I have an understanding of that because it affects directly the way we will work with that child in our own educational setting. So I think this boundary spanning role is crucial to working with children and young people in education and the related fields that we work with. And it's particularly important as we start to develop our professional knowledge and, if you like, think about how the issues for the children and young people we work with aren't bounded by single professional roles. That actually children's lives are very complex, and if we're working with a child or a family or a young person, that whilst our main focus may be within the educational field, the chances are that child, that young person, their family is going to be coming into contact with other professional fields at various times, and we have to have an understanding of those professional fields and how they work. In other words, we need to become boundary spanners. And that this slide emphasises, if you like, the art of boundary spanning as it's presented here, that it's about building sustainable relationships. So in a sense, it's about establishing those relationships with other colleagues, with other professional fields, and being able to sustain those over a period of time. That it involves us both influencing and bringing to bear our own professional expertise, but it also expects that we take on a negotiation role, that we're not fixed or rigid within our professional field, that we're able to maintain and manage the levels of complexity and interdependencies. In other words, our roles impact directly on the children, the families, the young people, but they also impact on other professionals working with those same children. And that we have to learn to manage a number of different roles, the way that we might be accountable to different people, and the different people that we work with may well have different motivations in working with that same child, that same family, the same young person. So I'm raising the issue of boundary spanning here, and we will come on to it again next year in the level 3 professionalism module that everyone will take throughout level 3. Because it's really important when we start thinking more and increasingly more about how we work with other adults that work with children and young people, this notion of being able to manage ourselves in relation to other professionals. Okay, so we've already established, if you like, that that part of being professional is that we are continually developing our knowledge. But we also need to ensure that we continue to keep an awareness of the way that the fields that we're working within are changing. And each time, if you like, a new government comes into power, there is often a renewed sense of policy development, which then affects the way services are developed and the way that professional fields are articulated. And I've put this slide in here to just remind us that increasingly roles become changed and redefined over a period of years. And we have to be prepared for that to take place. Those of you that have been in the field of working with children and young people for a number of years will remember how, for example, the teaching assistant's role changed quite dramatically with the introduction of the higher level of teaching assistant. Those of you in early years will recognise how the status, if you like, of the early years professional and then the early years teacher has changed over a period of years. And those of you working in youth work may well recall that have been there in working in youth work for quite a number of years will remember how under the last government, under the Labour government, youth work became redefined through targeted services and through services such as connections. And that development of the professional field that we work in and the nature of professional status, that will continue to change. So it's important that we are, in a sense, develop a professional flexibility so we can respond to those changes. And at the same time, this notion of professional recognition then changes. And that's not just in the fields that we're working with on this degree, on a whole variety of professional fields, the way that professional recognition, professional status and professional qualifications are kind of developed, that's changing as well. So increasingly, for example, to become a qualified teacher, you gain that qualification through working in the school rather than going to university first off to do a degree or PGCE. Through the School Direct programme, people are undergoing training in the school itself. And that notion of changing professional recognition and changing professional acquisition of knowledge, that's something that's increasingly part of the field that we're working in. So we need to be prepared for that to continue to change and be prepared to adapt to that changing field. And so just as much as we need to become professional chameleons or professional platypuses or professional frogs evolving over a lifetime, we need to be prepared to, in a sense, look beyond the immediate everyday practices that we're involved in and think continually about how we develop our professional knowledge, how we kind of, if you like, become researchers of our own professional field in order that our professionality, our professional knowledge, our professional practices continue to evolve and grow. I don't know if you've ever kind of been around people that have in a sense, been in work for a long time and stopped that inquiring approach to the work. I think you can often see where people have stopped asking questions of themselves and of each other. They've stopped looking to develop, and I feel very committed to the notion that it's important that we all continue to look for our practices to be informed and developed. And if you like, it's the reason why on this particular module, on KV518, we ask you to do a piece of project work which develops your own expertise in a particular field. And as you move into level 6 next year on the honours degree programme, we'll do more of that. We'll ask you to start to work in groups to develop your professional knowledge and research a professional field. And then in the final year course, you'll have the opportunity to develop your own individual piece of research, your own inquiry into a particular area, again to develop your knowledge further. And in this way, you become experts in the field that you work in. And that particular focus of interest that you have within your own broad professional field is also what defines your professionality. So I would really encourage you to kind of think about the areas of your practice that most inspire you, that most interest you, and that they become the areas that you continue to research and read and develop your knowledge and practice within. And in that way also that you become a resource in the field that you're working in, either for the immediate setting that you're part of or across a particular area or a particular field where you're the person that people know a lot about that particular area of work. So you become experts in your professional field, and I think that's a very important part of who you are professionally. So this last slide then says, okay, so in conclusion, we're thinking about this notion of professionality in terms of how it defines who we are in terms of our professional status, the knowledge, the training, the qualifications we've undertaken, the way we work within a particular field, the focus of our practice and how that changes, the level of autonomy we have, how much, in a sense, agency do we have in our particular field, how much ability do we have to direct our practice in an everyday sense, and the recognition that we have for our professionality from others, from other colleagues, from the families and the members of the public we work with, and from our immediate friends as well, people that acknowledge the work that we do. That's all part of, I think, I would see as our part of our professionality. And that a responsibility that we have in terms of being professional is that we continue to think about how that role changes and develops and how we contribute to that future that we have in terms of our own professionality, that we recognise that that's never standing still, that there's always a responsibility for us to develop ourselves professionally, and that at times involves us to, as you are now, undertaking a period of study, but even if we're not studying formally, there's an inquiring nature to how we work that's part of being a professional in the field that we work with. Okay, that's the end of this podcast. I hope it's been useful. As always, do give me some feedback if you found it particularly interesting or if you've got further questions. And I look forward to seeing you again for the next podcast.